if then we have a reparation loan and this money has been granted as a loan to Ukraine, the money wouldn't be there anymore. And that would cause tremendous trouble to Euroclear, which I just explained is a huge institution of systemic importance for European capital markets. If Euroclear would fail, capital markets might come to a standstill. That's how important Euroclear is.
Okay, let's turn our attention then to this frozen Russian cash. European governments have agreed to indefinitely freeze up to £185 billion worth of Russian assets that have been held in the EU since the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Now, most of Moscow's cash is held in the Belgian bank Euroclear, and European leaders are hoping to agree a deal at next week's EU summit that would allow the money to be used to help Kiev fund its war effort. After almost 4 years of war, Ukraine is running out of cash and needs an estimated £119 billion over the next 2 years. Russian officials are perhaps unsurprisingly accusing the EU of theft, and yesterday the Russian central bank said it would sue Euroclear in a Moscow court in response to these EU plans. Now, Veerle Colaert is Professor of Financial Law at KU Leuven University in Belgium. Hi there, Veerle.
Hi, Nick. Good afternoon.
To people who might be coming new to this, just explain how these Russian funds were frozen, what they've been doing up until now, and what this new move actually means.
Yes. Well, these assets are at Euroclear because Euroclear is not just a bank, it is a central securities depository. It means that it is the biggest institution in the EU responsible for ensuring that exchanges, transactions in securities, shares, bonds, that they are actually executed, that they are settled, meaning that the bond or the share is given from the seller to the buyer and the money goes from the buyer to the seller. So it's Euroclear who settles that for all transactions in the EU, almost. So that is what they do. So that also means that if a foreign country like Russia wants to invest its foreign reserves in Europe, in European companies or in European government bonds, it needs to hold a securities account and a cash account at Euroclear. And so it is because Russia had a lot of assets invested in Europe that it had such a large amount of assets at Euroclear. Most of them were bonds. At a certain time, at a certain point, they came to maturity. And so they were converted into cash. And that is why there's now such a large amount of cash on the accounts of Euroclear, which Euroclear contractually owes to Russia, but it cannot pay them out. It is not allowed because of the sanctions. They are frozen there. That is the situation, yes.
So the development is the agreement to indefinitely freeze the assets. Now, that sounds to me like seizing the assets, which, of course, is a very different status for that amount of money to be in, isn't it?
Well, no, I must disagree. It is not seized. It is not confiscated indefinitely because the legal instrument on the basis of which it has now been frozen indefinitely clearly states that if Russia ends its war, pays reparations to Ukraine, and there is no economic emergency anymore in Europe, then the Council will decide to lift the freeze and the money can be paid back to Russia. So it is, at least formally, not a confiscation. It is still a freeze. The question is whether the same can still be said if it is lent, this money, to Ukraine. In theory, it is still not a confiscation because this money must be paid back by Ukraine once it receives reparations from Russia. The question is obviously whether Russia will ever pay reparations to Ukraine. Because if it doesn't, then Ukraine doesn't need to pay back the money to the EU and to Euroclear, and then Russia will never be paid back.
So do we see this as a stepping stone towards the process of actually releasing that cash, whether it's as a loan or anything else, to Ukraine so that it can use it to fund its war effort?
Yes, I think this first step was a necessary precondition because you must know before the sanctions had to be prolonged every 6 months, and unanimity was needed because this is done under the heading of common foreign and security policy. And in the EU, decisions in that field need to be taken with unanimity. But we have, as you know, an outlier in the EU, Hungary, which is quite pro-Russian. And so every time the sanctions need to be renewed, there is a fear that Hungary might veto it, especially since its elections are coming up. The fear was growing that it might veto the prolongation of these sanctions. And so if those sanctions are not prolonged, that means that Euroclear immediately must pay back that money to the Russian central bank. So if then we have a reparation loan and this money has been granted as a loan to Ukraine, the money wouldn't be there anymore. And that would cause tremendous trouble to Euroclear, which I just explained is a huge institution of systemic importance for European capital markets. If Euroclear would fail, capital markets might come to a standstill. That's how important Euroclear is. So it was indeed important to make these sanctions indefinite in time, so that if this loan is granted, the risk would be smaller that Euroclear would ever have to pay back Russia when the money isn't paid back to it.
So is the legal point that is perhaps to be decided whether or not the EU has the right to take this money from Russia because of its well, I'm sure they'd be characterized as illegal actions in invading Ukraine?
Yes, well, what the argument is that it is giving this loan to Ukraine as an advance to the reparations with Russia, which Russia would need to pay to Ukraine after the war. So under international law, indeed, the aggressor must pay the invaded country. And so Europe is saying this is just an advance to those reparations. So if Russia indeed pays reparations to Ukraine, then it's fine, and it has complied with its international obligations, that then Ukraine would need to pay the reparations back to Euroclear, and Euroclear could pay back the Russian central bank. That's the idea.
Veerle.
And then in this situation, this would be fine under international law.
I'm with you. Veerle, Colaert, thank you so much for sharing your expertise so clearly with us. Professor Colaert is a professor of financial law at the KU Leuven University in Belgium.
There is an unwavering support that is needed for Ukraine, and Russia really has to pay for the war, for the unjust war and for the aggression, and the frozen assets needs to be used for that. The question is, of course, that today there are some concerns from our side as responsible politicians, so it's clear that we look to the vulnerabilities, that we look to the legal and also the financial risks that are linked with the proposal that is on the table. Minister, of course, I also can give you the big elements that are important for us, but you know that there are many concerns on the table, some of them very technical, of course linked with the guarantees, linked with the liquidation mechanism, linked with the burden sharing, and I think it's now up to our experts, because that is also what we are now doing, sitting together with the other experts to find solutions and to come to a constructive proposal. We need to have, of course, a legally binding solution, and I think that is his main concern. And the exact steps will be determined once there is a final proposal, hopefully next week at the Council.
Well, we are working very closely with Belgian authorities to address the concerns which Belgian authorities are having, and indeed had gone, I would say, great lengths to address them.
And it's absolutely important we work out as a European Union a mechanism as to how we're going to support Ukraine. And at its core, that mechanism has to do two things. It has to fundamentally support Ukraine in the here and now because the funding need is urgent. But secondly, it has to also make sure that Russia pays. And I welcome the fact that today or tomorrow this week, we will take measures to immobilise on a longer term basis Russian assets. I think that's an appropriate thing to do.